Welcome to our Bible class this morning. I'm glad that you decided to join me again. Today we're going to be studying 2 Peter chapter 9, verses 10 through 19, about a desperate situation that no one wants to find themselves in. In the heat of the summer of 2020, a tragedy occurred outside of Rockwall, Texas. David Bridges, a well-known jurist and well-respected jurist, died in a traffic accident. It was an accident that just didn't need to happen. A car driven by Megan Smith was going the wrong way on the road when she hit Bridges' car. Such is the danger of being on the wrong road. When Peter writes the second chapter of the second letter, he waves a warning flag in front of people saying, "This is the wrong road, go a different way." And that's when he warns of the false teachers. He says, "But false prophets also arose among the people, just as there will be false prophets among you." Today, he wants to move one more step in that process, because we find the teachers ignoring the warning signs, and they are remaining, by choice, on the wrong road. One great truth emerges. When you stay on the wrong road, it's a road that leads to perdition and death. Peter wants us to see the tragic effects of that being on that wrong road. The Bible is replete with stories about man's sin. In the Garden of Eden, we watch Adam and Eve as they take the first bite of the forbidden fruit. It altered the trajectory of human history. 2 Samuel chapter 11, we stand in a dark hallway. We watch as Bathsheba leaves David's chambers. It will only be a few short weeks until she becomes his wife, gained by illicit means. These are pictures that are familiar to us, and yet in this lesson the concept is darker and blacker. It's not merely sin that we meet. It is evil, a kind of evil that courses through the life that changes its whole dynamic. There comes a time when sin changes into something worse. It changes into depravity. And so Peter opens this lesson by continuing his thoughts from last week. And especially those who indulge in the lust of defiling passion and despise authority. Bold and willful, they do not tremble as they blaspheme the glorious ones. He speaks of those who indulge the lust. The picture of that word is to make a journey, to get on a road. These are teachers who are continuing on a journey into the deepest pits of human depravity. It leads them somewhere no one ever wants to go. One thing they do is they stop fearing the fearful. There are many beings who are much more powerful than mankind. When you read the Bible, you find angels coming in the lives of men, and when that happens, there seems to be this sense of awe and fear. They fall down at their feet. They want to know what's the matter and what needs to happen. There is this total respect for the being of the angel and for the authority of God that he brings. Yet, these teachers have lost all respect for anything holy or godly. He says that they despise authority. They are bold. They are willful. Peter uses words of frightening consequences. They spit in the face of authority. They're audacious about their own power, and they will do as they please without fear of consequences. And so when the topic of angels come up, they go, who cares about them? They slander and they deride them. That's how they feel about God. That's how they feel about his messengers. That's how they feel about anything holy. That's how they feel about anything except for themselves. Something happens when you lose your fear and respect for God and the holy realm. You become your own God. You now have no boundaries. You now have no consequences. You have no one to listen to. That's not something you want to lose. Children who lose respect for their parents become wild and unruly, oftentimes committing crimes later in life. Recently, we've witnessed crowds who could care less for law and order with predictable results. And once it happens in a moral life, when there are no restrictions and fear of the Almighty disappears, life becomes nothing more than trash. And what follows next is another step in the tragic journey, because these teachers have lost all sense of shame at the same time. There's a saying that goes, there is honor even among thieves. When Paul confronts the Corinthians about the blatant incest in the church, he says it was a form disgraced, disdained by even the pagans themselves. There is something to be said about even the worst of societies have standards that you don't break. They may not be high standards, they may not be good standards, but there are standards that you do not break. So when you fall below the standards of a sensual society, you're at rock bottom at that point. But that's exactly what those teachers have done. But these, like irrational animals, creatures of instinct, born to be caught and destroyed, blaspheming about matters of which they are ignorant, will also be destroyed in their own destruction. Peter compares these teachers to animals or creatures of instinct. They have no morals. They have no understanding. They have no reasoning power among themselves. You couldn't reason with them if you wanted to. You could say, now what does this accomplish? And they wouldn't care. You could say, what kind of morality is this? And they would not respond. They operate on the moment and the impulse of their life without thought of morality, without thought of decency, without thought of consequence, without thought of anything but, will this please me right now? And that is what animals do. When my youngest daughter had finished her education, she got a job in research involving monkeys. Now, for most people, monkeys are curious and cute. They do fascinating things. But my daughter tells you that they are still monkeys, and that they are not to be trusted, and they are not as cute as they seem. She would describe coming into the lab the following day, and the monkeys may have fought among themselves. Many lost eyes or fingers. Some were still dripping blood from the scars of the fight. They were brutal. They could be destructive. They could harm people. They were cruel beasts, something that Peter had in mind. They have no reasoning about themselves. They never ask, is it right? Questions of consequence never arise. Effect on others makes no difference. These are just animals who will destroy themselves with their own lifestyle. So Peter adds to this sordid picture. Suffering wrong as the wage of their wrongdoing, they count it pleasure to revel in the daytime. They are blots and blemishes, reveling in their deceptions while they feast with you. These false teachers get payback, which is probably a reference to their desire for money in the first place, from their evil. They will be paid back with the wrong that they are giving. It will return to them. They revel in the daytime, Peter says, and that was a shocking accusation. Even in degenerate Roman society, it was scandalous to commit evil acts in the day. You might be a profligate at night. You might be a drunk at night. You might be a murderer at night, but don't drag it into the daylight. That was reserved for cover of darkness. And yet these false teachers that Peter describes have decided to bring it out in the open, in the day, where everything can be seen and no one can judge. Dear Chrysostom represents that Alexander the Great, after feeling that other men had been all the well-nigh ruined in the soul by luxury and idleness, said that they were slaves to money and pleasure. The teachers, with their sensuality so unbound, is the foundation for our English term, hedonism. Hedonism is the pure pursuit of pleasure, regardless of consequence, regardless of the future, and regardless of who it hurts. It's the 60s all over again that says, if it feels good, do it. In recent events, the name of Jeffrey Epstein has arisen. Epstein was a brilliant man, apparently, wildly successful, well connected with presidents and monarchy to boot. He owned his own private island, his own private jet. He could seem to do as he pleased, which is exactly the picture of 2 Peter. And he did it without regard for right or wrong, only for what was pleasurable to him. And so he stooped so low as to commit even rape on the most innocent. And he could get away with it by threats or payoffs. If you want a current picture of what Peter is talking about at the end of the first century, there's the picture. That's the same road that the false teachers who said that they were Christian traveled upon. But their pride didn't drive them from the church. What we think that somehow that when people sin, they'll go, well, I'll just leave the church. Not always. A lot of times the church is a good cover for what they're doing. They just became more entrenched in those congregations. They came to the love feast, the first century setting for the Lord's Supper, and they sat there without shame. Peter called them blots and blemishes on the feast. They were cancers that disfigured the body of Christ. And if you allowed them to stay, if you didn't dispute them, and they remained, the church would be damaged. Peter's not finished with his dark black brush. They have eyes full of adultery, insatiable for sin. They entice unsteady souls. They have hearts trained in greed, accursed children. They employed the Playboy philosophy, which sees every woman as a sexual conquest. Women were to be used and disposed of at the pleasure of the teacher. That tends to have become a staple of most sects in our society, whether it be David Koresh in the 90s, Jim Jones in the 70s, or any other would-be Messiah that comes along. They always want to use women especially for their own sensual pleasure. It is a mark of the falseness that they bring. And that kind of rampant immorality coaxes those who don't have the spiritual stability to know what to do. They are the prey among the wolves. The teachers hook the bait, which is, you can have everything you want, and God will still love you. You can have all the money you want. You can have all the pleasure you want. Don't worry about it, because God is a God of the spirit of the intention. And as long as your spirit is right, your body can be foul. And so they caught all these people up in their own debauchery. Do like I do and you can be as free as I am. It's a slippery slope that skids to a dead-end finish quickly. No wonder then that Peter ends with an exclamation there under God's curse, because they've gone to the spiritual gymnasium. That's that concept of training. That's the word. They've gone to the spiritual gymnasium, developed an ability to be wanton, to lust for more and more power, more greed. They are accursed children. They are under God's curse. It is a putrid picture of what a life that has gone to seed looks like. But then on top of it, while they think they own so much, they are really owned by something else. They've been bought with a terrible price. In the 1960s, American culture convulsed under the constant bloodshed of an unpopular war and the call for utter freedom. 50 years later, we have some of the same kind of thinking there. No one can tell us what to do. We are free. We have liberty, they say. We can do as we please, and no one can tell us any different. Get out of our business and let us do our thing. This was the philosophy of the false teachers. Since the Spirit is all that matters, we have complete freedom to do as we please in this physical realm. Yet truth is inescapable. You can twist the words, you can change meanings, but the reality doesn't change. Because those who believe they are free are many times carrying the heaviest chains in life, the chains of self. While these men's greed pursued what they wanted with every step, the reality was that they were being bought by the sin that they pursued. It owned them. They were held in jail by their own need that they could never get out. To describe that best, Peter goes to the book of Numbers for his illustrations. Forsaking the right way, they have gone astray. They have followed the way of Balaam, the son of Beor, who loved gain from wrongdoing. But he was rebuked for his own transgressions. A speechless donkey spoke with human voice and restrained the prophet's madness. He reminds them of Balaam, whose story is told in Numbers chapter 22 to 25. He was a hired gun, a prophet for price. Balak, the king of Moab, hired him to curse the Israelites, believing that a curse from a man like Balaam would go a long way toward turning the tide of the upcoming battle they would have. After all, if they were under the curse, they would not be successful. Balaam and Balak agreed to a price, a handsome price, a king's ransom, that would benefit Balaam greatly. And so Balaam, getting what he wanted, made his way to do the deed. But something happened on that road. An angel turned him back. But Balaam, who professed the gift of prophecy, who thought he was a seer, could not see the angel. A strange paradox. The seer could not see. But the donkey on which he was riding could see the angel. And the donkey stopped. Angry, Balaam beat the donkey. And the more he beat him, the more the donkey pushed. And he pushed against the rock ledge and crushed the foot of Balaam against it. And that made him even angrier. And he began to beat the donkey even more furiously. Until finally the donkey turned around and says, "What did I ever do to you to make you do this? Have I ever been like this?" A donkey reasoning with a prophet. Interesting picture. That's when the donkey reveals what was happening. That comes to light. The donkey talked, rebukes him, and suddenly the angel shows up before Balaam. And he tells Balaam one thing. "I will let you pass, but the Lord will not permit you to curse the Israelites. You will bless them, not curse them." Now that's not what he's being paid for. So he went and he tried to curse them. But he couldn't. God would not permit it. Instead, he blesses them, and it created a furious Balak. It seemed to be that what Balaam wanted he could not have now. But he had another plan. He wasn't finished. He knew that if the people forsook God, they would be punished. And perhaps if he could do that, it would be just as good as a curse. So he concocted a plot that the women of Baal Peor would entice the young Israelites into adultery. And that brought swift retribution on both the offenders and the Moabites. And Balaam could not escape it either. Numbers 31 makes it clear that they also killed Balaam. When people give their lives over to that kind of depravity, they forge their own chains of slavery. They lose any kind of influence, any right to be listened to. They have no good for anyone, as Peter will show in 2 images. They are waterless springs and mist driven by a storm. For them, the gloom of utter darkness has been reserved. He says they are waterless springs, a place where the parched would come only to find nothing to quench their thirst. Or they were mist driven by the storm, never doing good that a mist could do, and always going back and forth, driven by whatever is happening next. When people chose to listen to these teachers, they would find their lifestyles and their teaching devoid of any kind of good, anything positive, and anything helpful. They were empty and worthless. God had a special place in hell for people like that. The reason is that they had put the chains, the rigid chains of hell on themselves. They have pronounced their own sentence. For, speaking loud boasts of folly, they entice by sensual passions of the flesh those who are barely escaping from those who live in error. They promise them freedom, but they themselves are slaves of corruption. For whatever overcomes a person, to that he is enslaved. Despite their boisterous professions about how smart they are, how wise they are, how spiritual they are, they could never overcome their own desires in a sensual life. They preach freedom, but they're really slaves. It's an observation that is so clear in many ways. The ancient philosopher Seneca said, "To be enslaved to oneself is the heaviest of all servitudes." Persius, the Roman satirist, spoke of the corrupt and immoral citizens of his day as the masters that grow up within the sickly breasts of yours. You're enslaved, even when you think you're free. The greatest freedom we find out in life is self-discipline, something these men will never experience. Think of people you've known in your life. I remember I counseled a man once who very broadly and very proudly said, "I am not an alcoholic." But when he started to describe his behavior, it was something that seemed to drive him. It was so bad that he was losing his family. He'd already lost 2 jobs, and he lost his driver's license for a short time for driving while drunk. And yet, he sat there in front of me and he said, "I have the power to quit whenever I want to." And I felt sorry for him in a way, that he thought he was so powerful and he was so weak. He was so free, and yet he was so enslaved. Because it was apparent he thought he was free. But he was in chains, his own chains, the chains he has made, through the choices, the decisions, and the road he decided to follow. It's something that a life headed down the wrong road of sin creates. So Peter wants to make it clear that as enticing as this teaching and lifestyle seems to be to some people, it has a dark underbelly. It destroys lives. It creates slavery. And this chapter has a single theme to it. Those who depart from God's ways and take a journey on a different road are headed for trouble and destruction. No matter how smooth their words or how grand their promises, departing from God's way is going to lead you into a life of so bad a sin that it will be called one thing: depraved. For that reason, there's a single lesson to this lesson. Before you follow someone, know where their life is going to lead. Because if you follow them, that's where your life will lead as well. Because pay attention to the road they're on, because on that same road, you'll find the same destination. Don't let that happen to you. And pay attention to those who are asking us to go the wrong way. Thank you for joining me today. It's been a pleasure again being with you, and I hope to see you again next Sunday as we continue our study of 2 Peter. Have a great day.